BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DEHAN, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DEHAN. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Alright, hello everybody. Today is Friday, another Anything Goes Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? So I would like to just drop a couple of quick announcements and reminders before we truly begin. And the first is that there will be a regularly scheduled episode about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey coming out this weekend here on BlackBoxOnlineRadio. And every Wednesday is now being devoted to Jack the Ripper in a regular segment here on BBOR. Previously, I had been talking about the Phantom Killer from 1946, and of course every Monday is Zodiac Monday, talking about the Zodiac Killer. But this is a subject for today's episode that I've wanted to talk about for quite some time, and that is the story of Richard Speck. When I was growing up, there were a lot of episodes on television shows about serial killers, particularly Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Jeffrey Dahmer, and of course unidentified serial killers such as the Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper. But I noticed that another person that they frequently discussed on these true crime programs was Richard Speck, and already some of you are probably thinking, now wait a second, Richard Speck was not a serial killer, he was a mass murderer. And I noticed that from the very beginning. I just began to wonder, why did people seem to have this type of fascination with Richard Speck? Because the differentiations between a serial killer and a mass murderer are that a serial killer kills multiple people over an extended period of time, and there has to be a cooling off period in between the violent acts, whereas a mass murderer can commit all the crimes in one night. Very frequently, mass murderers are mass shooters, but Richard Speck was a different type of mass murderer, and he is somebody who does remind me a lot of serial killers, but I think that people are curious about how serial killers function for two particular reasons. Let's not kid ourselves. There is an element of morbid curiosity, but they also want to know what and how is this person doing to allow themselves to blend into society, to interact with people, and to just put on this very gentle facade, and then in reality the person is an absolutely vicious murderer. How does that happen? And believe it or not, this actually comes from Dr. Phil of all people. I heard this back in 2019 when he said the reason why he became a psychologist was he wanted to know not only why did people do the things they did, but what were they thinking when they did it. And a lot of people have that type of curiosity about serial killers. With Richard Speck, though, everything that I have noticed and observed from him from watching true crime programs is rather to the contrary. It's more just the mystery doesn't seem to stand out in any fascinating fashion. In fact, he just seemed like a jerk who got out of control. And that's the reason for the namesake of today's episode. Let's have the most basic encyclopedia introduction about Richard Speck, and this was written by Marie Duray. Richard Speck, in full, Richard Benjamin Speck, was born on December 6 of 1941 in Kirkwood, Illinois, and he died on December 5th of 1991 in prison. He was an American mass murderer known for killing 8 female nursing students in a Chicago townhouse in 1966. Richard Speck was the 7th of 8 children. Soon after he was born, the family moved to Monmouth, Illinois. Speck's father, to whom he had been deeply attached, died of a heart attack when Speck was 6 years old. 3 years later, in 1950, his mother remarried and moved with her husband to Dallas, taking Speck and his younger sister with her. The children were frequently verbally and physically abused by their often drunk stepfather. And no matter what, I think that a lot of us have that moment when we just think, even though this person grew up to do some terrible things, we still feel a little bit of sadness for the kid who is being abused, because we're talking about someone who is as young as age 6 or 7 or 8. No matter what, though, it seems like the adult was in the wrong at that point. But Richard Speck didn't try to get away from that type of life. Instead, he turned into somebody who was recreating the cycle of destructive behaviors, because as we're going to see very clearly here, he was arrested for the first time when he was 13 years old, and he left high school at 16. In 1962, Speck married a 15-year-old girl named Shirley Malone. Their child, a girl, was soon born thereafter. The marriage ended in divorce in 1966. In 1963, after numerous additional arrests, Speck was convicted of theft and check fraud and sentenced to 3 years in prison, but he was paroled after 16 months. In 1996, in order to avoid another arrest in Dallas, Speck returned to Monmouth. While there, he robbed and raped a 65-year-old woman, and he is thought to have beaten another woman to death. This is what I was talking about when I said that he just had deviant behavior that escalated. He was a mean and nasty person who got out of control, because it's not only these horrendous crimes here, such as raping a 65-year-old woman and possibly beating another woman to death. It's also the stories of check fraud. It's the stories of theft. He was a criminal deviant, and his destructive tendencies would not only go from check fraud to theft to crimes that would not send you to jail for life, they escalated to murder and then mass murder. And I'm heavily reminded of the story of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, and I did an episode about his case here on BlackBoxOnlineRadio last year, and I invite everyone to listen to that, but I'm noticing some particular differences, except Richard Ramirez was a serial killer, but my assessment of them is roughly the same. A jerk who got out of control, a mean person, a selfish person who just kept pushing the boundaries and ignoring the rules of society, the social conventions, and of course, most importantly, ignoring human empathy. Richard Speck, Richard Ramirez, Richard so-and-so. It's the same story repeating itself over and over again. But in terms of trying to analyze this person's type of psychology, they showed little to no regard for anything other than their own selfishness. Back to the article. After being questioned about the murder, that's the one that he was accused of, Richard Speck fled to Chicago, where he stayed with a sister. He eventually settled into a Skid Row hotel near the National Maritime Union hiring hall, where he had applied for work as a merchant seaman. On the night of July 13th, 1966, Speck gained entry to a townhouse in the vicinity of the hiring hall, which had been shared by 9 female nursing students. After binding the women's feet and hands with strips of bedsheet, he murdered 8 of them by stabbing and strangulation or both. One of the victims was also raped. One of the women was able to escape by hiding under a bed. The next morning, hours after Speck had left the scene, she crawled out of a window and called for help. And there is another story that will say that she actually crawled onto a balcony, so it is not as dangerous as it seems, crawling out a window and then onto a balcony, as opposed to jumping out of a multi-story window or something like that. After he committed the murder, Speck went into hiding and tried to commit suicide. Taken to a hospital, he was arrested there after an emergency room physician noticed a tattoo on his arm that said "Born to Raise Hell," which had been mentioned in newspaper reports of the crime. Yes, the surviving witness even talked about that. But, a tattoo that says "Born to Raise Hell," and he goes on to be a mass murderer, stabbing and strangling 8 nursing students. Are you not yet convinced of my assessment of him? That he was a nasty person who just kept making things nastier and nastier. Are you not convinced of that yet? I mean, I think it's just clear as day. Speck was originally sentenced to death in the electric chair when the Supreme Court declared capital punishment unconstitutional in 1972. Speck's sentence was changed to 8 consecutive terms of 50 to 150 years. He was refused parole a number of times and died from a heart attack at age 49. And you always notice these things about how someone gets 150 years in prison. I was talking recently about James Holmes, the Aurora, Colorado shooter, and he was sentenced to thousands of years in prison. And I've never liked decisions like that because someone can't live that long. And in the case of Richard Speck, very clearly he did not. You could sentence him to 10,000 years in prison, and he died at the age of 49. But that isn't necessarily the biggest thing that disappoints people about Richard Speck. One of the final television specials I remember that was promoting his story was called The Lost Tapes, and it was talking about videos of Richard Speck while he was in prison, not only discussing the murders of the 8 nursing students, but also talking about the way that he lived and how he survived in prison, and saying that he was having a hell of a good time doing drugs, particularly cocaine, and he was also taking hormones. So he had, well, man boobs, for lack of a better term, and fat deposits on his body in a very feminine way, and he had lots of relationships with men in prison, and that was how he stayed alive. That is why people chose not to murder him, and just people were thinking that he wasn't suffering. He murdered 8 people, as well as all of those other crimes that he committed, and very simply, he was not actually being punished. He just even found a way to push the boundary out of that way, or manipulating a system in a particular way so that he wasn't experiencing the type of punishment that people thought that he should. And some additional info on the surviving victim. Her name was Corazon Amaral. She was a Filipino nurse, and there's an article that it was written about her for Esquire by Rona Alondra, and this was published in 2021. Corazon Amaral, the Filipino nurse who survived a massacre and put a mass murderer behind bars. On the chilly evening of July 13th, 1966, unbeknownst to her, Corazon Amaral would be the lone survivor out of 9 nurses who murderer Richard Speck brutally slaughtered during the South Chicago Community Hospital massacre. After quietly trespassing on the home, Speck calmly knocked 4 times on Amaral's bedroom door. When she answered, he proceeded to round up the nurses from each of their rooms, leading them one by one to separate rooms in the townhouse, where 8 nurses met a tragic end. Only Amaral escaped that night. Exemplifying great courage and strength, we navigate through the story of Corazon Amaral and the night of the South Chicago Massacre. This is the retelling. Those who knew Corazon best found it no surprise that she survived the gruesome massacre, and as she was born and raised Batagueño, and she boasts Batangas as the land of bale song, a double-handled folding pocket knife, such that its blades, when enclosed, are concealed with the grooves of the handles. Being one of 8 children, Corazon was the hardest working student in school, often praised for her grit and ability to adapt quickly to new and difficult situations. To provide a little bit of clarity, I mean, this article definitely is trying to make it sound a little bit puffy, but to provide more clarity, she survived by hiding under a bed, and what people think is that Richard Speck simply lost count of the number of victims that he was attacking. So he has these women that are tied up with bedsheet, and instead of murdering them all at once, he was taking them out and murdering them one by one, and they were unable to move. But as far as Speck's activities go, the fact that he attempted suicide, to me, shows that this was someone who did this in a very calculated act. He wanted to have power over these women, and he also wanted to create as much destruction as he could before committing suicide. I mean, the tattoo said it all, born to raise hell. Back to the article from Esquire. It was a normal day in mid-July after working a shift at the South Chicago Community Hospital. Emerald took the shuttle back to the townhouse she shared with 8 of her fellow nurses. After following her usual routine of washing her clothes and writing letters to her family back in the Philippines at 10:30 p.m., she decided to head to bed in the room she shared with Merlita Gargulo. Though their everyday lives were composed of early mornings and tiresome shifts and late-night shuttles, Amaral recalled the peaceful mundanities that their lives held, and it had meaning. However, that peace would soon be disrupted on the evening of July 13th, 1966, when she came face to face with Richard Speck. Speck was born in Kirkwood, Illinois. Like Corazon, he was one of 8 children and was also born into a large religious family. See, that is something that actually surprised me about how they both had 7 siblings. Odd coincidence. It's safe to say that Speck's childhood was not all rainbows and butterflies. It was his early introduction to violence, alcohol abuse, and juvenile delinquency, which would soon lead him to a life of crime. Okay, but here's a very big point. Lots of people are born into that life. Lots of people have violence and abuse, and they even have some juvenile delinquency, but they don't grow up to be mass murderers because they recognize that there are other ways to live. And that is also part of the namesake of this episode. Richard Speck seems to have known exactly what he was doing. It doesn't appear that he was experiencing any type of uncontrollable psychotic episode. It seems like he wanted to kill people because he wanted to inflict pain on other people, and he just simply didn't care about humanity. Before Speck committed the horrifying mass murders of the 8 student nurses in Chicago, he was responsible for acts of violence against his family, which was the cause of his wife's filing for divorce in 1966. Now, I'm just guessing here. The fact that he gets divorced in 1966 and the fact that this mass murder takes place in 1966, I'm seeing that there's probably some type of connection that, even though I said he didn't care about humanity, he probably doesn't seem like someone who would have been too cozy with anybody, but perhaps the divorce affected him and affected his mental state in some way, and it could even be as simple as maybe he didn't have power over her, or that he was just so infuriated that someone would want to leave him. And I am guessing at that. I am guessing. I mean, I don't know that as a hard fact, but it does make me think about it. In the same year, Speck had been linked to a significant amount of horrifying crimes whose victims, mostly women who were either robbed, raped, or ruthlessly murdered. However, Speck seemed to have the devil's luck on his side. Despite his multiple connections to the scenes, Speck was never charged with any of the murders which he was suspected of, cases that remain unsolved to this day. But he still could have done it. Either that or federal incompetence. Speck always found a way to deflect police questioning, escaping each time. That is until his luck ran out in the vicious case of the South Chicago Massacre. And, I think that his deviant behavior was just escalating, going up and up and up, and then just it turned into the mushroom cloud of death. When Richard Speck broke into their home, he came in sheep's clothing, disguised under false pretenses of soliciting help. Corazon Amaral was the first in the house to see Speck when she opened her bedroom door to the knock. The knocking was done in a normal manner, she would later testify at the trial. Armed with a .22 caliber and a hunting knife, Speck's towering figure and pockmarked face greeted Amaral and her colleagues with swift hostility as he forced his way into the nurses' bedrooms at gunpoint. Speck caught the 9 unsuspecting victims on the South Chicago Community Hospital grounds off guard before he pounced like a wolf in the night. Speck held Amaral and Gargulo hostage. The women watched helplessly as Speck cut strips of fabric from their bedsheets, which he would later use to bind them. He proceeded to round up the nurses from each of their rooms and order them to empty their purses before tying them up. 3 women, Gloria Davy, Mary Jordan, and Suzanne Ferris, were fortunate to be out of the house during Speck's preparation for the massacre, and the same brutal fate fell upon them once they arrived at the townhouse. What would have been an exhausting day's comfort and rest instead set in motion what we can only imagine as the most brutal and most horrific 4.5 hours of their short lives. I mean, I think that sentence shouldn't even be included in the article. It seemed that Speck was a little disoriented. Apparently he drank heavily at several Chicago bars before breaking into the nurse's townhouse. In a window of opportunity, Amaral and Gargulo had a chance to discreetly work at loosening the hand ties and giving them a brief second to hide, and of course only Corazon survived the attack by hiding. Merlita Gargulo, Corazon Amaral, and Valentina Passion had the chance to break free. They hid in a bedroom close to where they heard their colleagues' muffled pleas and cries for help echoing within the apartment dormitory. In a moment of deceit, they heard Speck reasoning that he only needed money to go to New Orleans, convincing the nurses who had just arrived back from the hospital to help him. And this is something that I found in a different article that I was unable to relocate again, but there are just so many ways I want to respond to that. Number one, this is very typical in true crime cases where the perpetrator wants to put the victims in a false sense of ease so they don't become hysterical. That could have been done on instinct. But I am also reminded of the Zodiac Killer's activities 3 years later, in 1969, when the Zodiac Killer holds up Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard with a gun and a knife at Lake Berryessa, and is telling them, "All I want is your money. I'm trying to get to Mexico." I mean, New Orleans would have been south of Chicago. Mexico would have been south of California in the Bay Area, where the Zodiac was operating. And it seems very similar. And based on how news coverage was shared in the 1960s, I think that the Zodiac Killer would have probably been familiar with the South Chicago Massacre. There are some major differences between Richard Speck and the Zodiac. Number one, Richard Speck was a home invader. The Zodiac Killer was not. The Zodiac Killer committed the Lake Berryessa stabbing outside. And number two, the Zodiac Killer was wearing a hooded costume when he committed the stabbing. Richard Speck was not. And in that other article that I wasn't able to locate again, I was reading some of the story of Corazon Amaral, and she talked about how she did not do an interview after the trial until the passing of Richard Speck, until he died in prison, because at that point she knew that he was dead and that there was no way that he would ever come looking for her. The fact that he actually had the possibility of parole is ridiculous. It is absolutely absurd, and I know he was sentenced to death. But then once the sentence was commuted, life with parole? No, absolutely not. That's ridiculous. For the following reason, someone who has showed absolutely no regard for the law in his entire life, and even if hypothetically he was rehabilitated to some point, this comes from Stephen Gay, one of the prosecutors in the Manson trial, and the Manson family trial, I should say, the Tate LaBianca murders. The primary focus of the justice system is not rehabilitation, it's punishment. And if someone is stabbing and strangling 8 nurses, then they definitely deserve to be punished for that. And as Corazon Amaral stated very clearly, she was afraid of the guy even though he was in prison. And I don't know this as a fact as well, but my instincts lead me to think that if he had been released, there's a very high chance that he would have gone after her because she was the surviving victim and she testified at the trial. And that's just my original take on the subject. I mean, hypothetically, if he had gotten out of prison, he probably would have tried to murder her because he wanted to just have power over the situation. This is the way that these types of criminals function, whether it's serial killers or mass murderers. They felt powerless, so they want to inflict pain upon other people so that they can have their brief moment when they can say that they were powerful. But when I was just playing around a little bit on Google and reading about Richard Speck, I found that a lot of people were talking about this crime as a random mass murder, and some people even called it the crime of the century. But with Richard Speck, I don't think this was the crime of the century. I don't even necessarily think that it was random. I think that it was a bad situation, meaning the entirety of Richard Speck's life as a criminal just getting worse and worse and worse and worse, and then it eventually reached a point that was so horrible, it was like the abyss, and it was just something that was just so dark and terrible that he was ultimately contemplating suicide because of it, attempting suicide because of it, and that was the end result. It had gone so extreme that he didn't even want to live himself. But there's also a power assertive element in the suicide of the mass murderer. They attempt suicide because they do not want to be punished for it, because if they can be punished for it, then the other person, the other parties, the justice system, the prosecuting attorneys, then they will have power over the situation. It's like someone commits a crime and then they kill themselves, therefore they have taken the power with them to the grave where no one will ever have it again. And it's terrible. It's terrible. Make no mistake. That is an absolutely terrible thing, but that is how it seems that many of these murderers are operating, and they are sick and twisted and demented individuals. But that is examining the thought process all the same. What do you think about Richard Speck and the South Chicago Massacre? And most importantly, I would say rest in peace to the victims, all the victims of Richard Speck, including people who were affected by his previous criminal activities. But please put your ideas in the comments section down below, and feel free to visit buymeacoffee.com/BlackBoxNet88 if you would like to support any of the efforts for this show. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there is always BlackBoxNet88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.